Hey everybody, welcome to this Beneath the Bible video. Right now we're doing a series called Before You Read. We know that the Bible can be difficult to understand, hard to comprehend, hard to understand the background, and so in this series we're wanting to just provide you with some resources and basic information and historical background to help you interpret the Bible better for yourself. Here's today's video.
Zechariah is a difficult book to understand. In fact, one scholar who wrote a whole book on Zechariah 1 through 8 starts it by saying, "I do not understand Zechariah 1 through 8. He follows it up by saying that even as a highly trained scholar, he finds Zechariah difficult to understand, almost impossible. Now, that's a lot of candor for a scholar who has spent so much time and energy studying this one text, but it goes to show how difficult this book can be. In Jewish tradition, the prophet Zechariah himself was said to have written some of the Targum for this book. The Targums are interpretations of biblical books in the Jewish tradition. So this means that even ancient Jewish communities found it difficult to understand this book and are said to have relied on the prophet himself to provide insights into what it means. Despite the difficulty of comprehending this book, the prophet Zechariah is the most quoted of the minor prophets in the New Testament. Scholars have noted a particular link between Zechariah and Revelation. This may be because Zechariah is an early and innovative piece of apocalyptic literature, and Revelation is a later example of this genre, so it's borrowing from precedents established in Zechariah. It's also possible that Revelation is relying strongly and directly on Zechariah. The four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation 6 and the horsemen in Zechariah may be one of many close links between these apocalyptic books. Given the difficulty of understanding this book, we'll just discuss quickly how scholars tend to divide the book and the content of these divisions. In general, the book can be divided into two major sections, with chapters 1 through 8 being a complete work and chapters 9 through 14 being another complete work. Chapters 1 through 8 are even called 1st Zechariah, and 9 through 14 are called 2nd Zechariah. Each of these sections can be broken down even further. And chapters 1 through 6 include a prescript, a call to repentance, and then 8 successive visions. Chapters 7 and 8 form a kind of segue and offer encouragement and assurance of God's presence and blessing. Chapters 9 through 14 can be divided with 9 through 11 being two oracles from God and discussing God's dealing with his people, and 12 through 14 discussing and awaiting glories in store for Israel in the latter day. The first verse tells us that Zechariah the prophet, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, wrote the book. Scholars are in general agreement that the first 8 chapters belong to this prophet. There's some confusion here, however, because of the genealogical information given in the verse. The problem is that in other sources, Zechariah is said to be the son of Iddo, but here he is the grandson of Iddo. In Nehemiah 12, for example, Iddo is listed as the head of a priestly family, and Zechariah is in his family. In Ezra 5 and 6, Zechariah is listed with his contemporary Haggai as a champion of the temple rebuilding project, but he's again called the son of Iddo. Here he is the grandson of Iddo and the son of Berechiah. And to complicate things even further, in Isaiah 8 there's a Zechariah son of Berechiah. This has led some scholars to suggest that Berechiah is added to Zechariah's genealogy to link him to the prophetic work of Isaiah. Perhaps the best way to rectify this inconsistency is to recognize that Zechariah was probably the son of Berechiah and the grandson of Iddo. In genealogical lists that appear in the Bible, when they go back a couple generations, they tend to go back to a person of importance, someone who is well known to the original audience. Iddo was the head of a priestly family who returned to the land after exile in Babylon alongside Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. He was presumably a well-known individual, so some places call Zechariah the son of Iddo even though his father was Berechiah and his grandfather was Iddo. This is like calling a descendant of David the son of David, even though there may be several generations between that person and David. So if this is accurate, that Zechariah was the grandson of Iddo, who was actually a contemporary of the high priest Joshua's son, then Zechariah would have been quite young during his prophetic ministry. As we said, scholars generally agree that Zechariah 1 through 8 are the work of the prophet named at the beginning of the book. Chapters 9 through 14, however, do not have superscriptions or any stated authorship. Most scholars do not believe the prophet Zechariah wrote the final chapters and instead see these as later additions to the text. Some think they may have been written by supporters or students of Zechariah, and some think they were written as late as the 3rd or 2nd century BC, long after the prophet died. We really don't know who wrote the final chapters if it wasn't Zechariah. And finally, it's worth mentioning briefly that the Zechariah mentioned in Matthew 25 is probably not the prophet Zechariah, but a different Zechariah who's mentioned in 2 Chronicles 24. As with his contemporary Haggai, Zechariah dates the visions of the first 8 chapters, so we know they were written around November and December of 520 BC. These dates briefly overlap with the work of Haggai. Another date given in Zechariah corresponds to February 15th, 519 BC, and the final date given corresponds to December 7th, 518 BC on our calendar. These dates, all in the first 8 chapters, correspond to the life of the prophet Zechariah. Chapters 9 through 14 have no clear dating. Some scholars do date them to the life of Zechariah, citing things like linguistic analysis showing the Hebrew fits the mid-6th to late 4th centuries, and socio-literary arguments that the social situation in the province of Yehud fits the anxieties expressed in the last several chapters. However, most scholars date these chapters to different times. For example, Matthew 27:9 quotes a passage from Zechariah but attributes it to Jeremiah. Some have suggested that Jeremiah wrote parts of these chapters and they were just included in the book of Zechariah, or even that there was a common prophetic corpus available to both Jeremiah and Zechariah. A critical scholarship tends to focus on the literary style, theme, and message and try to find a time that fits best. They have suggested times from as early as the 8th century to as late as the 2nd century BC. Scholars don't really know how to handle these latter chapters. Some see them as commenting on events occurring at the time they were written. They see echoes of Alexander the Great's conquest of the region or of the Maccabean revolt. Others see these chapters as interpretations of earlier prophetic works, as there are quite a few references and allusions to the works of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others. Zechariah 11 seems to be pretty pessimistic about the return of the Davidic line, and given that there was a lot of optimism about this during the time of Zerubbabel, we may reasonably date this chapter to time after Zerubbabel's leadership in the late 6th century. The entire book of Zechariah can be classified as apocalyptic literature, which is a difficult genre of writing to understand, interpret, and contextualize. While this type of literature looks forward to the future realization of its contents, it's also anchored in a time and written to a particular audience that needed to hear its message. Despite the difficulties of understanding apocalyptic literature, it is a particularly important genre to contextualize and understand in its original setting. The time of Zechariah 1 through 8 is much the same as the time of Haggai. Zechariah's prophetic work can be securely dated to between 520 and 518 BC. This was a period early in the reign of Darius the Great, the Shah of the Achaemenid Empire, based in what is now Iran. This was a tumultuous time in the world as the empire was experiencing rebellion, particularly in Egypt. It took several years of Darius's reign to bring the empire back under control. This was also a time of great expectations. Cyrus had allowed the Jews in exile to return to their homeland, and Zerubbabel and a high priest named Joshua led the people back to Jerusalem. Zerubbabel was a great-grandson of Josiah, and his grandfather Jeconiah or Jehoiakim reigned for 3 months before being deposed. So Zerubbabel was of the Davidic line, and this was a time of messianic expectations and hopes for a restoration of the Jewish people. And while Haggai and Zechariah are generally optimistic about the restoration of the Davidic line, Zerubbabel never fulfilled that expectation. So there's a longing and a promise for a future messianic figure in the line of David. The rest of Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14, is much harder to give a good context for. This is in part because it's not always clear when it was written or what it's really communicating. Sometime between the 6th and 3rd centuries seems solid, with the exact dating depending on what evidence you weigh and therefore what context best suits the writing. It's perhaps even more important to understand the ways these chapters are cited in the New Testament than it is to understand the original context, since these chapters were interpretive keys for how the early Christians understood Jesus. The best example is probably Zechariah 9:9, which Jesus enacts in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem in Matthew 21 and its parallel passages.
Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give it a thumbs up and take a minute to share this video with your friends. You can also connect with us online on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible or on our website, beneaththebible.com.